Ex-racists of Reddit, what made you change your mind? I'm Asian and I grew up kind of resenting my parents for being different than my classmates' parents, and I hated that they didn't know how to speak English. I had to translate for them all the time, call phone companies, go to the DMV with them, translate documents, etc., and I grew resentful. So when I was in elementary school I told them that I wasn't Korean but that I'm a full-fledged American and I wasn't going to speak Korean anymore. I also hated interacting with other Asians that reminded me of my parents, aka textbook internalized racism. It wasn't until middle school when I had a teacher that validated my culture and actively tried to communicate with my parents that I realized that bilingualism is an asset and something I should be proud of. Now I'm going into teaching and have done some translating work on the side. People say my Korean is super fluent for an American-born Korean, and I really have my parent to thank for that. Now I'm super regretful for hurting them like that. I never made the choice really to be racist, but I grew up in South Mississippi and my family wasn't overtly racist, but they were the kind to say racist things behind closed doors and didn't allow us to watch TV shows such as The Cosby Show or Fresh Prince, and definitely no rap music in the house. I absolutely fell in love with a lot of black artists in the early 90s. I loved the hip-hop scene at the time, and holy shit, Fresh Prince was the best sitcom on television. I played football with 80% black guys and worked at Popeye's Chicken with over half the staff being black. I guess you can say my own real-world exposure, despite their attempt to shelter me, changed me. I cringe at some of the vernacular I used in my early youth, as the N-word was the same as black in my house. I literally was not raised to know that was a bad word. I'm glad that from the age of maybe 12 on I learned to love all people on my own. My grandma grew up in Virginia in the 1900s. Being racist is just the default setting. Nana loved her family more than anything, though, so at one point in the late 1980s, she met her first not 100% white grandchild, and discovered she still loved him. She made astounding late-life progress accepting that darker skin-toned people were not only people, but family, friends and welcome in her house. Reminds me of what a comedian said. "Yay, I grew up in a very racist part of Virginia called Virginia." Short answer: rap music and a curious mind. But what's more impressive is how thick of a shell it cracked. My stepfather, who pretty much raised me, was a Klansman, and so is his father, brothers, etc. This was an old-fashioned family too. My mother didn't speak unless spoken to. My sisters were expected to marry who my stepfather chose. This was normal to us. I was expecting to find a woman to marry and start a family as soon as I was 18. I'm 23 now, so this was recent. My stepfather beat my older sister black and blue for sleeping with a black man. He always told us that black people are and gangbangers, and that Mexican while hard workers are all dirty people and will never amount to anything useful aside from cheap labor. He controlled what we watched and played to reinforce his beliefs in us. On top of this, he was a devout Christian. The first was a closeted atheist since 16, but he would have literally killed me if he knew. He believed that gay people should be killed alongside of atheists and Muslims. He wasn't focused on Jews for whatever reason. I had never met a person of color until I was 17, so I never experienced anything firsthand to contradict what I was told. Sometime in my late teens I discovered rap and was obsessed. First song I heard was by Tupac and I was obsessed. Well, as I learned more, it led me to Martin Luther King Jr. and what he did for people of color. At some point I broke down crying because I realized everything I was told was a lie. When I realized I was an atheist, I decided I couldn't operate under my old mindset, so I needed something to replace it and decided to go with the speech that broke my hatred. I decided I would judge everyone based on their actions, not the color of their skin or who they prefer to sleep with. I remember when my sister and me were young, our neighbor had a traveling nurse who would visit and often bring her daughter. We took to the daughter right away, but things went sour when my dad found us hanging out in the basement playroom. Never saw her again after that and never understood why. Later, when I attended my first day of high school, I was a nervous wreck, but I did meet a nice kid who sat next to me in homeroom. We had tons of similar interests which I thought no one else shared. I came from a small 15-student per class elementary school. On the way out of school I was with this friend and introduced him to my mom. Over dinner my mom says to my dad, "Tell dad who your new friend is at school." "Oh, it's a cool kid named Chris." and tell Dad what else about him. It was then I realized everything. My parents were racists. My whole family is quite racist. When I was little I was trying to wrap my head around the rules of the world, so I thought it was as simple as different teams. Blacks versus whites was just like the Red Sox versus the Tigers. Then my grandmother starts going on about how horrible Polish people are and how I'm never to talk to them, so I'm psyched. Screw those Polish people, whatever color they are, we're mortal enemies. Then she points out our Polish neighbor to me, but she's white. I point out to my grandmother that she's white so we're on the same team. My grandmother says no, that she's a mixed breed. I point out that my great-granddad was a Shoshone Indian and that I'm a mixed breed. She says that doesn't count. That's when I realized she was just making up the rules and I wasn't going to play games with someone who couldn't stick to the rules. A guy I worked with said he was neo as a teenager, and ended up in prison somehow. He hated Jews for some reason, and blacks. He was never clear on why. Just that he had so much hatred in his heart, and that was his outlet. He was in prison for many years. I think he almost killed somebody by beating them up. So, many years later and in prison there was a mentor-type staff there, and this one lady was so helpful to him, and she cared about him so much that it really started to get into his head the idea of being a positive person. Then, he learned that she was Jewish, and he said he couldn't believe she was so kind and caring despite the fact he was acclaimed neo. From that day he swore to be a better person. He learned his lesson. He's a pretty great guy these days, doing his family thing and making sure his son grows up with lots of love and all that he didn't have. Really remarkable. Great guy. It seems that what you were taught as a child is sometimes so hard to overcome. Not myself, but many former racist or at least, now less racist friends of mine were able to have their minds changed just by simple exposure, especially to non-whites that didn't fit the stereotype. At first, it starts that they are just one of the good ones. But after a while when they meet enough good ones, they start to realize that the good outnumber the bad and their racial worldview starts to crack. Doesn't work on them all, though. Some are racists due to education and esteem issues. But many are racist simply from lack of exposure to other races, only having what the media and environment they live in tell them to fill in that gap. Absolutely. It's all about exposure. It's how Daryl Davis was able to get so many Klansmen to leave the He just persistently involved himself in their lives. He wanted to learn about their beliefs and practices. He wasn't scared away. He found common ground, mainly through music and religion. And eventually, these people got to genuinely know a black man, and all the ridiculous beliefs and ideologies suddenly stopped making sense. I think it's because once you actually know these people, race is no longer an abstraction. It becomes real. When someone says black people, you'll no longer think of a concept. You'll think of people you know who are black. They are human beings you can tell stories about. So when someone starts generalizing, you think of those people. Black people are violent, uneducated, blah blah blah. When you hear it, you may think of that black neighbor of yours from across the street who let you borrow his lawnmower that one time. He's violent and uneducated. That's not fair. Bill's a nice guy. It becomes real when someone is talking about someone you know rather than just abstractions. I wouldn't say I was ever racist so much as ignorant. I grew up in a very white town. If I had stayed there, I probably would have been just as ignorant, and my only exposure to other cultures would be the media. I got out and work in a large city with a multicultural workforce. So basically, meeting people from other countries and realizing that we're all pretty much the same and just trying to live life. My uncle used to be the most racist person I knew and it drove me crazy. But he is an old white man and set in my ways, is what he would say when confronted. It all changed the day his great-granddaughter was born. His granddaughter had married a black man and he was unaccepting until that baby was born. She had him wrapped around her pinky finger from her first breath. Since then there are several mixed children in the family. It's awesome to see the difference in his behavior. He genuinely loves them all and accepts the racially different spouses of his grandchildren and the children. If he hears anyone being racist he shuts it down. Oh man, I worked at a doctor's office a few years ago. We had a patient come in, white lady carrying a newborn black baby. I mean, he was like 2 days old. We chatted a little bit, and she told me she had been on a waiting list to adopt a baby for years. She had gotten a call the night before, saying a woman in Detroit had just given birth and she wants to give up the baby. They asked if she wanted him and explained he was black. She was so excited. She got to the hospital right away, but she told me she had called her parents on the drive over to inform them of the good news. They were elated at first, until they realized their grandchild was going to be black. She told me her parents said that she either chooses them or the baby, because they won't be related to an she said. Hung up the phone with no regrets. She was so in love with that baby. He was a cute little guy. College roommate was Muslim. Definitely was not a terrorist. Kinda already knew my paps was wrong about that, but when you live with someone for an entire year, it takes you from kinda already knew to holy shit, that way of thinking is up. I got into D&D in college. Kinda surprised my dad when I told him Ahmed was my dungeon master.